One of the most important things a leadership team needs to get right is their rhythm of meetings together. Everything from one-on-one meetings with their direct reports to daily huddles to ad hoc meetings to discuss issues or opportunities to what I call weekly accountability meetings, monthly check-in and education sessions, quarterly planning meetings, and the annual planning retreat. And on this episode, I want to focus on the annual planning retreat. It is such an important part of this, what I call the planning and communication rhythm. Such an important part. Leaders typically screw it up. And if you feel like you get it right, beautiful, listen on. I'm sure you'll hear some ways to improve it. But what I see very often is, number one, frankly, leadership teams that don't even do an annual planning meeting. Not that they don't do it the way I recommend to do it, but they don't do it at all. Maybe the CEO sits in his or her office, comes up with priorities for the year, has a vision in her head, and it's communicated on an as-needed basis to the members of the leadership team. I've also seen leaders that say, of course, we do an annual planning meeting. In fact, we've got it, coming up on Friday. We're going to spend 2 hours going through our annual plan. You cannot possibly discuss the things you need to discuss, build the team the way you need to build the team, make the decisions you need to make, create the plans you need to create. Can't do that in 2 hours. So let me take you through my recommendation, the objectives and how it's facilitated and what the topics are. And I hope you can glean something from this. And, the objective of this session, I think, is threefold. Number one, it's about alignment. It's about getting the senior leadership team aligned together around what's most important. Not just everybody out there working as hard as they can, trying to be as smart as they can, but how do we get aligned on what's most important? So number one is alignment. Number two is focus. How do we get not only aligned on those things that are most important and those decisions that we need to make, but how do we get focused on the one most important thing or the two or three most important things? Very often I say to a leader, what's most important for you this year, or what's most important this quarter, what's most important to the company? And they'll give me a list of 8 or 10 or 12 things. It should be 1 or 2 or 3. So it's about alignment, it's about focus, and it's also about team building. And when I say team building, I don't mean trust fall exercises or marshmallow exercises or any of that stuff. I mean the sheer fact that you're working together for a significant period of time, having open, honest discussions, that in itself helps to build team, helps to build you into a true team of leaders versus a group of really talented folks. How do we build you into a team? And that could happen just for the sheer hours you're working together. I have had clients, and I normally recommend the session is 2 days, but I worked with a client actually a couple of years ago that did 4 days. And it wasn't 4 days of me coaching and facilitating them through. They did 4 days because they knew they had 2 days of real work. And I'll explain what that work is in a minute. But they knew they had 2 days of real work. And what they did from a team building standpoint is they made it 4 days and added in some other stuff like hikes and, longer meals together and obstacle courses and things that they did to also help them create better team. So whether you do 2 days or 3 days or 4 days, this is not a 2-hour or a 4-hour session. This is something that really you should use to help you create, predict, project, but create a successful next year. That's what it's all about. How do you create that through the alignment you have, through the focus you create, and through this great team that you always continue to build? So that's the objective. There is typically some pre-work involved when I facilitate my clients through annual planning. I like them to do pre-work. I have a survey that goes out. What's your vision? What do you think the vision of the company is 10 or 15 years out, 3 years out? What's the most important part of your strategy? What's part of your strategy you don't agree with? There may be a SWOT analysis I have people do pre-work. I have something called the Breakthrough Leadership Team Assessment that I have them do, which is just a way to assess the strength of the leadership team. That pre-work is important because you gather a lot of great information that way, but more than gathering information, what it does before the session is it gets every leader just to start thinking about all this stuff we're about to talk about, to put that strategic, visionary leadership hat on and get out of the day-to-day grind and the day-to-day tactics. So there's typically some pre-work involved. Notice I called it an annual planning retreat, not a session. I find it's pretty important to have that off-site. Off-site could mean, flying to a beautiful island somewhere, but off-site could mean a room, you pay for at a hotel a mile away from the office. It's important to get out of the office. It's important to get out of the office for a tactical reason. People don't get interrupted that way. There's no, hey, can I just, see Linda for a minute? When people, when we take a 10-minute break and you're on site at the office, people get hijacked during that 10-minute break, but it doesn't happen if you're at some off-site location. Being in an off-site location is just helpful for people to think differently. If you're sitting in the same damn chair in the same conference room, you tend to think the same way you always think. But when you go somewhere new and different, you can be a little bit more creative. Last thing I want to tell you before I dive into what the agenda looks like is how this thing is facilitated. Now, very often it's the CEO that facilitates the annual planning session. But let me inject a little commercial for coaching here. I have seen it, and my clients have seen it, to be critical that the CEO has the ability to participate in the meeting. And when you're facilitating the meeting, it is almost impossible to facilitate the way you want to facilitate. When you're participating, you might get caught up in an argument or caught up in a debate and not realize it's not a critical one to move things forward. And you could spend an hour on it and then lose the ability to talk about something really important. When you're the CEO and you are participating, sometimes when you're facilitating and participating, you can tend to do the opposite and cut a discussion short because you've got a strong opinion and not give the people around you a chance to air their opinions and to challenge your opinions. Very often as the leader, when you state an opinion, it can feel like a command instead of an opinion, whether you mean it to be that or not. So having an outside facilitator who's the one that could worry about how we're doing on the agenda and where we are on time. So the CEO doesn't need to worry about that. Having a coach and a facilitator in the meeting to drive, to make sure everyone's voice is heard when you're debating an issue or an opportunity, to help coach the leader, help coach the CEO to make sure that they speak last. All of those things become really important. So my clients find it so valuable to have a coach and a facilitator in the room, because if the CEO needs to do it, not only will they not do it well, but man, that's tiring and really difficult to do both. The other thing I'll say about facilitation is there are very simple ways to make sure everyone's voice is heard around that table. And that's so critical. And if you just bring up a topic and have everyone discuss it, what I'm sure you'll find is I find with the leadership teams I work with is there are some leaders that like to take the lead and like to be heard and like to engage in conflict and just, that's who they are and where they're comfortable. And there are other leaders that like to sit back and listen and are not necessarily as comfortable challenging the status quo, challenging the popular opinion. And sometimes those quieter folks could get drowned out by the louder folks. So there are ways to facilitate very simply. I'm a big fan of flip charts and Post-it notes. Let's get everybody's ideas up on Post-it notes, up on a flip chart, and then talk through them so the quietest among you has as large a voice as the loudest among you. That all being said, let's dive into what I think are the major parts of the agenda of a annual planning retreat, remembering the objective of alignment, focus, team building, which means we're going to focus in the agenda on things like long-term vision. We're going to focus on strategy, more that 3-year view. What differentiates us? What are the strategies that will enable us to achieve that vision? We're going to talk a lot about people, culture, structure, and we're going to talk about how to execute. What are we doing over the next year? What are we doing over the next 90 days? So that all being said, let me take you through the agenda. I always like to start all agendas with some form of good news. Really important to start there. Not only does it get the meeting started, on a positive light, even if you had a real tough year, but if people know coming in that you're going to start off by focusing on some form of news, they start to think, what good news do I have? And I am a true believer. You get more of what you focus on. So if we focus on the positive, if we focus on good news, we will get more of that. I have seen leadership teams just, down and nothing's going right. And they're having a really difficult time of it. And they're worried about so much. And then we dive in and we start with some form of good news and the world changes for them. And all of a sudden they go from down in the dumps and not very creative to super creative, clearing their minds, giving themselves the ability to think in a really powerful way. So in the annual planning, my form of good news is, what are the bright spots? And let's imagine we are, I'm recording this in 2024. So let's make believe we're planning 2025. I would start out with, what are the most important 2 or 3 bright spots from 2024? And that means everybody writing on a couple of Post-it notes what the bright spots were for the company or for themselves, putting it up on the flip chart. And bright spots, not only from a business standpoint, but I like to include personal bright spots as well. Now, for some people, that may feel like a waste of time. This is about business, but it's really important for building a powerful team for you all to get to know each other and start rooting for each other, from a personal standpoint. So understanding what wins people had during the year, I think, is pretty important. And of course, understanding the wins from a company standpoint to start out is important. Again, it starts us off on a positive light. You get more of what you focus on, and it starts us thinking, how could we leverage those wins into the next year? So we start off with bright spots for the year. We then go into lessons learned from this past year. What are the most important, again, 2 or 3 lessons learned from your successes, from your failures, from your mistakes? Could be from a positive experience or a negative experience. What were the 2 or 3 most important lessons learned? And from those lessons learned, is that good to know? Like, thank God we learned that lesson and we've already taken action on it? Or is there some action we need to take on that lesson learned? And again, when it comes to these first two agenda items and almost everything I talk about moving forward, the bright spots, the lessons learned, it starts off, hey, get out a Post-it note, write on 2 or 3 Post-its what your bright spots are, what your lessons learned were. And when we get there, they go up on a flip chart so we can talk about everybody's bright spots. So we can talk about everyone's lessons learned and what are the actions we need to take from those lessons. So those are the first two agenda items, bright spots and from the previous year, lessons learned from the previous year. And by the way, if I didn't say it, normally with my clients, these annual planning meetings happen in November or December, planning for the next year. Some people like to do it much earlier, like September. That makes sense sometimes, but my fear is that's a little too early. You've still got a lot of 2024 left, and you're trying to plan 2025. Now, there might be a budgeting process that happens sooner, but the annual planning retreats I do are typically November, December, not always. So, first two, bright spots, lesson learned. The third thing I like to do, and I do this in all of my quarterly meetings as well as the annual planning meetings with my clients, is something I call pulse check. Pulse check is a way to throw 2 or 3 questions at the group that help to identify, one, how are people feeling about the company and the team right now? What are the major issues we need to make sure we talk about at some point over this 2-day session? What are the major opportunities we need to discuss? Very often, the most important topics we need to discuss are not topics that are on the agenda. And when we throw 2 or 3 pulse check questions out there, and one question could simply be, how are you feeling about the company right now? Another one I like is, what is our number one obstacle to profitable growth? It might be, what's something we're afraid to talk about that we need to talk about? What's one opportunity we need to move faster on? What's the biggest issue our employees are having, or the biggest issue we're having with our team members? What's the biggest issue we're having with our clients? You get the idea. And I have an inventory of about 35 or 40 different pulse check questions that I pull from. But when you put those questions to the group, 2 or 3 questions, write your answers on Post-it notes, put them up on a flip chart. That drives so much great discussion. And what I tend to do is not, what I always do, frankly, is I don't dive deep into any issues or opportunities or discussion items that come up. I don't dive deep into them right then. Because if we do, we're in danger of spending 2 or 3 hours on stuff that's not very important. So what I do is when we go through the pulse check for each question, I ask a question. I say, is there an action we need to take? I call it a who, what, when. Is there a who, what, when we need to take as a result of this? And if it is, let's document it. Is this an issue we need to add to our issues list? Is this a potential annual priority or quarterly rock, which is quarterly priority? Or is there no action we need to take here? Yes, that's an issue. We're working on it. We don't need to talk about it anymore. We don't need to take any action. It allows us to go through the pulse check questions more quickly, and we wind up with a pretty powerful list of potential priorities and focus areas that come from it, and potential issues and opportunities that we add to our list of potential discussion topics, which we'll get to a little bit later. Okay. So the third agenda item is pulse check questions. The fourth is, now we're going to look back, and I don't like to spend a lot of time looking backwards in an annual planning meeting, but we're going to look back at how we did for the year and how we did for the quarter this past year. For both of those, we're going to look at how we did from a numbers standpoint, financial targets, non-financial targets. How did we do? How did we do on our annual priorities? Did we achieve them? If we did, what did we learn from them? If we didn't, what did we learn from that? How did we do on our quarterly rocks, our quarterly priorities? Again, if we achieved it, What value came out of that? What did we learn from it? If we didn't achieve it, what did we learn from it? So we're going to look at our, key performance indicators, our numbers. We're going to look at our priorities. And again, we're going to spend as much time on that as we need, but I like to spend way more time looking forward than looking back. So we're not going to spend a half day going back through a gnat's ass level of detail on every priority and every KPI. We're going to talk about what's most important. Next on our agenda, now we're going to look forward, and we want to talk about vision and strategy. And within vision and strategy, we want to talk about what I call our two core ideologies as it relates to the vision moving forward. And number one, it's looking at our core purpose. Core purpose is your why. For example, Disney's core purpose is not theme parks or movies. It's probably happiness. Starbucks' core purpose is not a cup of coffee. It is a third place. We've got work, we've got home, we've got Starbucks to go relax and have a cup of coffee and people watch or do whatever we're doing. So what's your purpose? What's your why as a company? And if you've got one, let's confirm it and discuss whether we're living it or not. What else could we do to better live our purpose? We're also going to look at our BHAG, our 10 to 15 year big, hairy, audacious goal, our flag on top of a mountain, our moonshot, whatever term you want to put on it. But how are we doing progressing towards our big, hairy, audacious goal? Or if we don't have one, or maybe we've actually achieved our big, hairy, audacious goal, talk about what our next one is. Because we want our leadership team to be aligned around this long-term, almost never changing vision of the company. We want them more than aligned around it. We want everyone to be an evangelist of that vision. So we need to get folks excited about that vision. And post the meeting, we need to get everybody in the company excited about that vision. But we need to talk about the long-term, almost never changing vision. And then we also need to talk about that kind of midterm 3-year vision. And I like the term 3HAG, 3-year highly achievable goal. So as opposed to a big, hairy, audacious goal, man, I don't know if we're ever going to achieve that, but how cool would it be if we did? A 3-year highly achievable goal is one you absolutely commit to achieving. And I'm borrowing that term from, the brilliant Shannon Susko and her book 3HAG and her coaching organization, Metronome United. So the 3HAG, again, it's a shorter term vision. It's a 3-year vision. What are the financial and non-financial targets? What are those differentiators that you need to build on over the next 3 years? And I also like the book Vivid Vision by Cameron Herold. And he talks about building, of course, a vivid vision. That's the name of the book. But it's more of a 3-dimensional view of what's the company going to look like 3 years from now, sound like, feel like, smell like. I don't even know what sense I'm missing. But this 3-dimensional view on, when we walk down the hallway, what are we going to hear? What are we going to feel? What's the media going to be saying about us? What are our clients going to say about us? What are our employees going to say about us? It's the 3-dimensional view. So when we talk about vision, it's the long-term, almost never changing, but then it's that 3-year vision and strategy. We then want to move into topics focused on people. And by people, one part of that is culture. And a big part of culture is, what are your core values as an organization? So in this topic, we might look at your core values, your non-negotiable behaviors, the 3 to 5 or 6 non-negotiable behaviors that anchor your culture. How do we feel about those core values? Do we still feel like those core values work for us? Do we have the right definitions? Are we living those core values? Are they just posters on the wall, or are we living them every day? Are they alive and well in our organization? What do we need to do to better live them? Do we need to recognize people more often for the core values? Do we need to change our hiring process to better ensure we're hiring people that are already living our core values? What do we need to do to take it from a poster on the wall to something we're living and breathing every day? So we're going to talk about culture. How are we doing on culture? Where do we need to work on culture? From a people standpoint, we're not only going to talk about culture, we're going to talk about structure of the organization, starting with the leadership team. And I did an episode not too long ago talking about the functional accountability chart. What are the functions of the organization? Who is the one person accountable for each of those functions? What are the measures of success for those functions? Do we need to reassign any functions? Do we need to add any new functions? Do we have people that are stretched too thin in how many functions they're accountable for? So we want to look at structure of the organization. So within people, we want to look at culture, we want to look at structure, and lastly, we want to look at talent. Now, there are a number of other podcast episodes where I talk about the quarterly talent assessment. Well, that happens in our quarterly meetings, but it also happens in the annual planning retreat. So we want to look at our talent one level down, all of the direct reports of the leadership team, and understanding who are our folks that are high performing, middle performing, low producing, which means they're low in productivity, and who are the folks that are low culture fit folks. What actions do we need to take to strengthen talent within our organization? What's our talent density indicator, which is a KPI that I've created? I believe I've got another podcast episode that talks about that, but real quickly, and it's going to be in my new book I'm in the process of writing called The Strength of Talent. But the talent density indicator is a KPI that measures the strength of talent. And very simply, it's your percent high performing folks minus your underperformers, which is your low producing or low productivity folks and your low culture fit folks. And if you take your high performers and subtract from it your low performers, you're going to get a number between negative 100% and positive 100%. Well, in the annual planning meeting, we want to look at that too. How are we doing? If we don't have the right talent, we are going to have a real tough time executing on what we need to do this quarter, this year, in order to create the vision that we just created, our 3-year view, our long-term, almost never changing view. So within people, we want to look at culture, we want to look at structure and accountability, and we want to look at talent. Next, we want to go back to those discussion topics. From the pulse check, we came up with some number of discussion topics, issues we needed to talk more about, opportunities we needed to talk more about, decisions we need to make. And here's where we'll prioritize which ones we need to talk about, which are the most important ones to talk about that will help drive our plan moving forward. Because by the way, we don't have our plan yet. We've got our 3-year strategy. We've got our long-term vision, but we don't know what we need to go do when we leave here. So in order to do that, there are some discussion topics we've got to talk through. So prioritize that discussion topics, spend time on discussion topics. We then move into, finally, the annual plan. And if you're in November of 2024, you're going to look at the plan for 2025. And in that annual plan, we're going to look at what are the financial and non-financial targets. Financial targets is, what do we want the P&L to look like in 2025? Non-financial targets are things that drive that. How many new clients will we need? How many new products or services, do we need? So let's look at the financial targets and non-financial targets. And then what are the 1, 2, 3 top priorities for the year? And when I say priority, a priority is not to reach our revenue target. We've got the revenue target. The priority is, what do we need to do? What big action or actions do we need to take in order to hit our financial and non-financial targets, in order to live our values, in order to drive us forward to our 3-year vision and our long-term vision? What are those big annual priorities? What are we doing not to work in the business, but to work on the business? So we've got our annual plan. Then we move into our quarterly plan. I believe the quarterly plan is the most important part of the plan. And it's most important because all these other things we're talking about, long-term vision, midterm vision, annual plan, there's not a big sense of urgency there. And even an annual plan, here's what we need to do this year. Well, in the next 3-4 months, the world can change. No, and if you told me, hey, Mike, you need to lose 15 pounds in the next year, I can still order a pizza tonight and feel pretty good about it. But if you say, Mike, you need to lose 6 pounds in the next 90 days, well, now there's a sense of urgency. There's a pretty big fire up my butt to make sure I do the right thing tonight, tomorrow, and the next day. So we need a 90-day plan because that's where we're going to take real action. So in that 90-day plan, similar to the annual plan, we need our financial and non-financial targets for our quarterly plan or 90-day plan. We also need our priorities. And in this case, I call those priorities rocks. And we have company rocks and functional rocks. Company rock is what are the 2 or 3 most important things for the company. And by the way, you should see alignment. There should be alignment between your quarterly rocks and your annual priorities. Your quarterly rocks are what's the next 90-day chunk of the annual priority. The annual priority should be what's the next 12-month chunk of our 3-year plan. Our 3-year should be what's our 3-year chunk of our big, hairy, audacious goal. And all of that you should be doing while living your purpose every single day and living your values every single day. So we need company rocks. And then functional rocks are, you might have a leadership team of 6 people, 3 company rocks. And by the way, each rock should have an accountability person, 1 owner. So if you have 3 company rocks and a leadership team of 6 people, you may have 3 owners. Whole lot of people responsible, but 3 people accountable. Now, I believe everybody around that leadership table should own at least 1, no more than 2 rocks for the quarter. So if you don't own a company rock, you might create a functional rock. If you head up finance, maybe there's something within the finance function. You want to commit to the leadership team that you're going to do to work on that function and improve that function over the next 90 days. And of course, if those functional rocks could align with the company rocks, all the better to get everyone focused, working on the same 2 or 3 most important things. So we now have our annual plan. We have our quarterly plan. We know who's accountable. We understand our financial and non-financial targets, our key performance indicators. We now know when we leave here what we need to go do. So the last thing we need to do is wrap things up. And the most important thing I like to do in wrapping things up is something called cascading communication. And in cascading communication, I like to get my leadership teams crystal clear on what they are agreeing to communicate out and down throughout the organization based on these great discussions they've had over the last couple days. And what are they agreeing should stay in that room and not to be communicated? So, for example, having your teams understand what the annual priorities are. What are the quarterly rocks? What are the financial and non-financial targets? All those things might be super important to communicate to your team so they can align around it and help you. Resolutions to any big decisions or issues or opportunities might be important for people to know. Over on the no side, there may be parts of the strategy or parts of the 1 year or 1 quarter execution plan that are important for the leadership team to know and no one else. The results of your talent assessment. Who specifically are the folks that are high performing or middle performing or low performing? Should not be shared with people outside the organization. other than in the individual coaching you might do with your people. And even then, I wouldn't suggest you say, by the way, we did an assessment and you were low performing. What you do is you sit down with them and coach them and help develop them wherever they were low performing. So that cascading communication is critical, because I've seen time and time again, people leaving that meeting and talking about things they should not be talking about because it wasn't clear before, or leaving that meeting and not communicating with their teams things that should be communicated. So that's a really important part of the wrap up. And then I also like to go around the room as part of the wrap up and just ask people, what they thought the most important part of the last 2 days were. Or it might be, hey, give me one word or a phrase describing how you feel about what you have all accomplished together over the last couple of days. Super good, typically a very positive way to end. So that was a mouthful. If you are not doing an annual planning retreat, I hope this convinced you to do one and helped you to understand what's most important. If you do one, if you do one, I hope you heard this and found at least one or two ways that you could improve how you run that retreat, or how you schedule it, or how you facilitate it, or if you want to bring in a coach to do something like that. Hope that helped. I always say, if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. An annual planning retreat is a super way to help you get there. As my friend Owen Fitzpatrick says at the end of his podcast, may the force be with you. Bye-bye.